Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Action Awareness, I want to talk about the Explorer action, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? The card has the ability, choose a minion. If it is the only minion on its base, shuffle it into its owner's deck. Some players might question why the Explorers have this action, since most of their cards are about movement, but the Explorers also have a theme about being the first player to be on a base. You see this with Crypt Looter as well as Lost City, so the idea is that if someone else beat you there, get rid of them and take their place. Rather than moving the isolated minion, however, Dr. Livingstone shuffles the minion into the deck. And this is really interesting, because for the briefest moment in time, Dr. Livingstone was one of the most powerful cards in the game. Why? Because in the What Were We Thinking rulebook, where the Explorers were introduced, shuffling was not included in the definition of effect. I was so excited when I saw this card and saw the rulebook, and that it would actually be exempt from the effect rule. The card was previewed a month before the game came out, and the effect definition was the first thing I checked the day the expansion came out. This was, however, immediately changed in the Big in Japan rulebook, and that, to me, is a mistake. I've always felt very strongly, in case you haven't noticed, that Smash Up is a game of counters and counter-counters and so on. No one card should be completely unblockable. There should always be a way around it. I don't really like the genre, but I think of a trick-taking game, and I apologize if I'm getting this wrong, but the concept of a trump card is generally that it isn't an automatic win, although sometimes it is. In many games, like AEG's own Custom Heroes, a trump card can trump another trump, and this can continue indefinitely. If there were only one ultimate card in these games, the person who just happened to draw it would be at an extreme advantage. According to my friends, this is what Rook does, and they hate it. But in Smash Up, cards are encapsulated in factions, which means that only the faction player has access. What does all this mean? I really want a way to get rid of the Game Guru, and I think that prior to the retcon, Dr. Livingstone was the perfect compromise on how to do it. Yes, there are highly specific ways to get rid of this minion, but Ninja Dojo Destruction doesn't seem like a viable alternative. Dr. Livingstone came out in What Were We Thinking, the 11th Smash Up set. Amazingly, 10 sets had passed without the ability to shuffle cards in play antagonistically. The closest Smash Up ever came was shuffling your discard pile into your deck, either to weaken the zombies or to make madness harder to return. The idea of place and return have existed since the core set, as well as destruction, the most ubiquitously used negation tactic. You can even cancel a minion's abilities and remove its power at a base, even though the minion is still there and would qualify a player for VPs. But shuffling hadn't occurred until this card. While the Vigilantes also used this tactic, that 70s expansion came out after the Big in Japan reversal, so at the time of the reversal, Dr. Livingstone would have been the only card that could bypass effect. And I think that's okay, because the card has a built-in counter. Don't make it the only minion on a base. And there's still a counter to this, because the Explorers can move a minion off the base, then play Dr. Livingstone with an additional action or on a future turn. Both players have some measure of control, as opposed to one overpowered card. And I think that shuffling a minion is at an appropriate level of rarity and nuisance to be exempt from the effect rule. Let's consider the other candidates. Destruction and movement are so prevalent that obviously it must be preventable. Returning to your hand is prevalent in a few factions like Aliens and Star Roamers, and there are a few other factions that have minor cards that utilize the ability, such as Into the Timeslip or Titania. While it's annoying to lose a number of power counters or powerful actions on a minion, you still get to replay the minion, and in certain cases that might be advantageous to the victim. It's why the aliens can spam beam-ups to replay their invader. The immediate access reduces the nuisance factor, but it is still popular enough to require negation, especially when that leads to a discard, which effectively is like a destruction. There's also placing on the bottom of the deck. This is also pretty rare, despite existing from the beginning with Disintegrator. In some ways, place is worse than destroy because the discard pile can be recycled either directly into play, into your hand, or shuffled into your deck. Note that shuffling discards into your deck requires an additional card or ability in order to get the minion to the same destination as antagonistic shuffling. But mostly, the bottom of your deck is purgatory. Some factions will go through their entire deck, but most won't. And very few cards actually care about the bottom of your deck, like the Matriarch or the Grannies. Again, this requires another ability to undo the bad location, such as shuffling your deck. It's also worth noting that place wasn't in the original definition of effect. Was it for the same reason, because of rarity, or was it an oversight? Someday I'll have to ask the designers. But placing isn't reserved for the bottom of the deck. Place is generic enough that you could place a card directly into the discard pile if a card said to do so, even though none of your cards do this as of that 70s expansion. So if we evaluate the smash up verbs so far, destroy is high frequency, medium high nuisance, return is medium frequency, low nuisance, place is low frequency, high nuisance. But what about shuffle? At the time of the rules change, Dr. Livingstone was the only card that did this, making it more rare than place, which had 2 cards. If you wanted to get technical, Critter Cube would make it the second, but that isn't a straight shuffle because you are stealing a card. Also, don't get me started on Critter Cube. Regardless, the frequency is still low, but the nuisance factor? It depends on where the minion ends up in the shuffle, which is impossible to predict, because it's a shuffle. It could be the bottom, making it just as powerful as place, or it could end up near the top, making it closer to return in nuisance. In the average case, I would say that there is medium nuisance. Both shuffle and place go down in nuisance as the game goes on, as the bottom of the deck isn't as deep as it is in the beginning. My final point is that because of the isolated minion limitation, this isn't a card that the explorers can use to break a base by themselves, not without extreme help. You couldn't just knock off a player's sole low-powered minion just so that you could break a base by yourself that same turn. The explorers don't have the ability to break an empty base from minions alone, unless it's Idaho Smith, in which case it's a different base altogether. In fact, the explorers themselves decrease the chances of this action firing because they have the crypt looters, which help them be the first one on a base. In other words, they present themselves from playing their own action. I realize that Knocked Into Next Week doesn't have this problem, but again, that was after the reversal decision, and maybe it's still rare enough to make an exception for shuffling. So what we have is a single card with a counterable prerequisite that offers an effective but non-devastating ability, and I think it should be immune to effect. By making this card slightly more powerful, you prevent Game Guru and similar cards from being much too powerful. Dr. Livingstone is an example of Smash Up finding new ways to bypass defensive powers, and the decision to reverse it is disappointing. I fully blame Critter Cube for this. Whether it's shuffling or place, one of them should have been able to get through defenses, but unfortunately, neither will now. Do you think shuffling should affect a minion? And if you do not, do you think that there should be any keyword that gets past effect? Let me know in the comments. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.